He once said, "I'm not ready to be a father." Now the millionaire CEO would give everything just to meet his daughter. Michael Anderson had spent his entire adult life building an empire that he believed would protect him from every possible vulnerability. From the outside, he was the embodiment of success, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed visionary who had turned his sharp instincts into a global company that dominated headlines and reshaped industries. He lived in a world of luxury hotels, private jets, and boardrooms where his word carried the weight of law, and to everyone who surrounded him, he seemed invincible. He thrived on the rush of closing impossible deals, on the admiration in the eyes of investors, and on the fear that flickered in the expressions of rivals. Yet beneath the polished surface, Michael carried a deep terror of one thing he could not control: intimacy that demanded more than he was willing to give. He could buy loyalty, he could command respect, but love was something he had never trusted, because love could unravel him in ways power never could. When Emily Harper entered his life, she was unlike anyone he had ever known. With her soft brown hair and striking blue eyes, she did not belong to the world of glittering cocktail parties and calculated alliances. She was genuine in a way that disarmed him, unafraid to look past his wealth and reputation to see the man beneath. At first, he resisted her, brushing off the flutter in his chest whenever she laughed, telling himself it was nothing more than a distraction. But her presence lingered, creeping into the quiet spaces of his life where ambition had once been enough. She made his penthouse feel less like a museum and more like a home, and for the first time, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe he could have both the empire he had built and the warmth of a woman who cared for him not because of his fortune, but despite it. It all came crashing down the evening she told him she was pregnant. They were sitting in his living room, the city lights spilling through the vast windows, the noise of Manhattan far below. Emily's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she told him, her blue eyes searching his face for reassurance. Instead of joy, Michael felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. The walls he had carefully constructed to keep his life in order seemed to collapse around him, replaced by a suffocating fear of responsibility, vulnerability, and the loss of control. A child was not part of the plan. A child was chaos, permanence, and a tie he could not sever without consequence. He rose from the couch and turned his back to her, staring at the skyline as though the answer could be found in the glittering lights. She called his name softly, but he could not look at her. The image of boardroom battles, of investors whispering about his personal life, of scandal headlines threatening the empire he had fought for, all of it crowded his mind. When he finally turned, his expression was cold, his voice steady, though his insides were twisted in conflict. "I'm not ready to be a father," he said, the words heavy with finality. Emily stared at him, her lips parting as though she couldn't comprehend what he had just said. She had expected fear, maybe even anger, but not this icy dismissal, not this brutal rejection. She had thought he would take her hand, that he would remember the nights he had held her close and whispered that she was the only one who had ever truly seen him. Instead, he had severed their bond with a single sentence. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her chin lifting with quiet strength. Without another word, she picked up her bag and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous apartment. Michael stood frozen, his chest constricting with a pain he refused to name. He could have stopped her, could have reached for her, but pride and fear rooted him in place. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than any slammed door could have. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had protected his empire, that he had prevented a disaster. Yet as the silence closed in around him, he felt a hollowness settle in his chest, one he would carry with him for years to come. He poured himself a drink and stared out at the city, convincing himself that she would forget him, that she would move on, that he had made a clean break. What he could not admit, what he would not allow himself to see, was that he had just lost something no empire could ever replace. Emily walked away from Michael's penthouse with tears blurring her vision, but she refused to turn back. The echo of his words, "I'm not ready to be a father," rang in her ears with every step she took down the cold marble hallway, and though her heart shattered, she clutched her stomach as if to remind herself that she was no longer alone. She told herself that she had to be strong, not for him, but for the life inside her. In that moment she chose survival over despair, and though she would spend many nights crying into her pillow, the seed of determination had already taken root in her. She packed her things within days, left behind the glittering chaos of New York, and moved to a small town hours away, a place where the skyline gave way to quiet streets and people greeted one another by name. The pregnancy tested her in ways she could never have imagined. She faced mornings when nausea kept her doubled over, evenings when loneliness gnawed at her, and endless worries about how she would provide for a child with nothing but a modest savings account and a heart heavy with betrayal. Yet every time she heard the heartbeat at her doctor's appointments, every time she felt a small kick ripple through her body, her resolve strengthened. She told herself again and again that love was stronger than money, that she would give her child a life filled with security, even if it meant sacrifice. She worked long shifts as a substitute teacher, and when her body grew too tired, she took on tutoring jobs from home, earning enough to scrape by. The day Lily was born, Emily felt her world transform. The labor was long and exhausting, and when the doctor finally placed a tiny, fair-haired baby with bright blue eyes into her arms, Emily broke down into tears of joy. Lily looked like an angel, her soft golden hair glistening under the hospital lights, her eyes so clear and blue they seemed to pierce Emily's soul. Holding her daughter for the first time, she felt an overwhelming wave of love that washed away the pain of Michael's rejection. She whispered promises into the newborn's ear, vowing that she would never let her feel unwanted, that she would fight for her no matter how hard life became, and that she would raise her to know her worth. The first year was grueling. Emily learned quickly that single motherhood was both the greatest blessing and the most relentless test of endurance. She spent nights pacing the floor with Lily in her arms, rocking her back and forth until exhaustion blurred the edges of her vision. She woke early to prepare bottles, to soothe cries, and to go to work with heavy eyes, surviving on sheer willpower. Money was always tight, and there were times when she had to choose between paying for rent or buying something extra for her baby. She sacrificed meals, wore the same clothes year after year, and turned down every indulgence. Yet none of it mattered when Lily looked up at her with those blue eyes and smiled, a smile so radiant it made every struggle worthwhile. As the years passed, Emily built a modest but stable life. She became a permanent teacher at a local elementary school, balancing her career with the constant needs of a growing child. She painted Lily's room with her own hands, turning it into a bright haven filled with hand-me-down toys and second-hand books. She stitched torn clothes, learned to cook simple meals from scratch, and filled their little apartment with laughter despite the absence of luxuries. Lily grew into a curious and kind-hearted girl, her laughter ringing through the hallways, her small hands clutching Emily's whenever she felt shy or scared. People in the town adored her, often commenting on her bright blue eyes that seemed unusual against Emily's chestnut hair. Emily only smiled and said nothing, though deep inside she knew exactly where those eyes had come from. Still, no matter how full her days became, the nights were more difficult. In the quiet after Lily had fallen asleep, Emily often sat by the window, staring at the moon and letting her thoughts drift to Michael. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he regretted his words, if he imagined the daughter he had never met. Sometimes anger surged in her chest, reminding her of how he had abandoned them, of how he had chosen pride and fear over love. But other times sorrow crept in, a soft ache for the man she had once believed in, for the life they might have built if he had chosen differently. She hated that part of her still longed for what they could never have, but she never let herself drown in those thoughts. She had Lily now, and that was enough. By the time Lily was 5, Emily had accepted that this was her life, modest, quiet, filled with challenges, but also filled with love. She no longer expected Michael to reappear. She told herself she had forgotten him, that his absence was nothing more than a closed chapter in a book she no longer needed to read. She poured all of her love and energy into her daughter, who was growing into a mirror of everything Emily had ever dreamed of raising: compassionate, intelligent, and full of light. What Emily did not know, what she could not have prepared for, was that fate had its own plans. The past she thought she had left behind was not finished with her, and the man who had once shattered her heart was about to return in a way that would shake the fragile world she had built. Michael Anderson continued to move through life as though nothing had ever touched him, at least in the eyes of the world. He was celebrated as one of the most brilliant young CEOs of his generation, the golden boy of business who could turn any venture into a success. Magazines featured his chiseled face and piercing blue eyes on their covers, labeling him a visionary, while articles praised his bold moves in the corporate arena. His days were packed with meetings in glass-walled skyscrapers, phone calls that shifted millions of dollars with a single word, and late-night parties where the champagne never stopped flowing. On the surface, he appeared untouchable, a man who had sacrificed everything for ambition and won. But when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, the silence of his penthouse gnawed at him in ways he never admitted aloud. For years he had told himself he had done the right thing by sending Emily away, by refusing the responsibility of fatherhood. He had buried the memory of that night beneath layers of work and indulgence, convincing himself that emotions were liabilities, that he was better off without them. But as time passed, the hollowness inside him grew harder to ignore. He often found himself lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling while a question circled in his mind like a predator: what if she had kept the baby? He would imagine a child with his blonde hair and blue eyes, running across a playground, laughing with abandon. Sometimes he wondered if the child would have Emily's features instead, her gentle smile or the way her blue eyes seemed to see right through him. The thoughts haunted him, filling his nights with an ache he could not numb with whiskey or fleeting company. The women who drifted in and out of his life were nothing more than distractions. They admired his wealth, his power, the thrill of being close to a man the world adored, but they never saw beyond the surface. They didn't ask about his sleepless nights or the heaviness in his eyes when he stared out at the city below. He played his role, charming them with effortless smiles and lavish gestures, but none of them touched the hollow part of him that Emily once had. He had believed he could close the chapter on her with a single sentence, yet her memory lingered in the smallest details. The scent of rain on the pavement reminded him of evenings they had walked together, a stray laugh on the street could make him think he heard her voice, and every now and then he would see a flash of chestnut hair in a crowd and his heart would stop before reality returned. 3 years after Emily's departure, the weight of his decision became unbearable. He found himself scanning faces in public places without realizing it, as though searching for something he told himself he didn't want. His pride insisted that he had been right to protect his empire, that love and family were chains that would have destroyed everything he had worked for. But his heart, the part he refused to listen to, whispered that he had thrown away the only thing that could have given his life meaning. He buried himself deeper in work, acquiring companies, expanding his influence, filling his calendar with endless obligations, but even the thrill of victory had dulled. Achievements that once gave him a rush now felt empty, and the applause of investors sounded hollow in his ears. It all came to a breaking point one late afternoon when he walked into a grand hotel in Manhattan, preparing for a dinner with potential partners. The lobby buzzed with polished guests and the hum of quiet conversations. He was going over numbers in his head when his eyes landed on a figure across the room. For a heartbeat, he thought he was imagining her, conjuring her ghost from years of regret. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became. Emily stood there, her hair slightly longer, her posture strong, her expression calm but guarded. Time had touched her but not diminished her, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her even more striking than before. Beside her stood a little girl, no older than 5, with golden hair that shimmered under the lights and eyes as blue as his own. She laughed, her small hand clutching Emily's, her voice carrying across the lobby like a melody. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him as the truth struck with brutal clarity. The child was his. There was no denying the resemblance, no comforting himself with coincidence. He saw himself in her features, in her bright gaze, in the tilt of her chin when she looked around curiously. His chest constricted, and for the first time in years, Michael Anderson, the man who could command entire industries, felt powerless. The deal he had come to secure no longer mattered. The chatter of the lobby faded into a dull roar as he stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. His heart pounded with a mixture of awe and devastation, because standing before him was the life he had once rejected, the family he had chosen to abandon. He had missed her first steps, her first words, every milestone that should have been his to share. And now, in the most ordinary of places, fate had ripped open the wound he had tried so hard to bury, forcing him to see the truth he had spent years denying. Emily had built a life without him, and he was nothing more than a stranger staring at his own daughter for the first time. Michael stood frozen in the middle of the hotel lobby, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat, his entire body tense as though one wrong move would shatter the fragile moment before him. Emily's laughter, soft but reserved, reached his ears, and the sight of the little girl clinging to her hand made his heart thunder in a way he had never known. He wanted to run to them, to speak, to close the distance and claim what was undeniably his, yet his legs felt as heavy as stone. For years he had convinced himself that his decision had been final, that he had closed the door and locked it forever. Now the door stood wide open, and what lay on the other side was not simply a woman from his past but a daughter who carried his very blood in her veins. He forced himself to move, each step slow, deliberate, as if approaching a dream that might vanish if he hurried. Emily noticed him before he reached them. Her eyes, those piercing blue eyes he had once thought would haunt him forever, locked onto his, and the warmth he remembered so vividly was gone. In its place was a sharpness, a shield forged by years of pain and survival. Her body stiffened, her hand tightening protectively around the little girl's fingers, pulling her slightly behind her as though instinctively guarding her. Michael stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit, a man who belonged to boardrooms and magazine covers standing in front of the very life he had once declared he was unprepared to embrace. "Emily," he said, his voice low and rough, stripped of the commanding tone that usually filled conference halls and silenced opposition. He had not spoken her name aloud in years, and the sound of it nearly undid him. "Michael," she replied evenly, her tone devoid of surprise. It was as if she had always known this day would come, as though she had prepared herself for the possibility that their paths might cross. But there was no warmth in her voice, no longing, only a cool acknowledgement, as though he were nothing more than an acquaintance she would rather avoid. His eyes fell to the girl, who peeked at him curiously from behind her mother. Her golden hair shimmered under the lobby lights, her small face radiant with innocence, and those bright blue eyes, his eyes, studied him with open curiosity. The sight hit him harder than any defeat he had ever faced. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because here was proof of everything he had thrown away. "She's yours," Emily said softly, her voice quiet but cutting, as though she had plucked the words from his chest before he could find the courage to ask. There was no accusation in her tone, only fact, cold and undeniable. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart pounding. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice trembling with an emotion he could barely contain. Emily straightened, her chin lifting slightly as her daughter clutched her hand tighter. "She's mine," she corrected firmly, her eyes locking on his with a mixture of strength and sorrow. She has always been mine. The little girl tugged at Emily's hand and looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, who is he?" she asked innocently. The question sliced through Michael like a blade. He wanted to kneel, to tell her the truth, to hold her and whisper that he was her father, that he had made mistakes but was here now, ready to make amends. But Emily's gaze warned him, her protective stance a silent declaration that she would not allow him to trespass so easily. Michael's composure cracked. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, but now his emotions spilled through every word. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw. "I was wrong." He wanted to say more, to beg for forgiveness, to explain the fear that had driven him to push her away, but the weight of her stare silenced him. Emily drew a steady breath, her grip on their daughter unyielding. "Regret doesn't change the past," she said, her tone sharp but not cruel. "Regret doesn't undo 5 years of nights I spent alone, 5 years of raising her without help, 5 years of watching her grow and wondering if I made a mistake by ever loving you. You don't get to just walk back in." Her words struck him with brutal force, more painful than any boardroom defeat, more devastating than any public failure. He wanted to argue, to plead, but one look at her face told him it would be useless. She had built her world without him, and she would defend it with everything she had. The little girl shifted on her feet, her small fingers brushing against Emily's leg, and Michael felt the ache deepen, because he was a stranger in the life that should have been his. Emily turned slightly, guiding her daughter toward the exit. She paused only for a heartbeat, her eyes meeting his one last time. In them he saw pain, strength, and a wall he wasn't sure he could ever break through. Without another word, she walked away, her daughter's golden head bobbing beside her, and Michael stood rooted in place, watching the family he had once rejected vanish through the glass doors. The noise of the lobby returned in a rush, the clatter of glasses, the hum of conversation, but Michael heard none of it. He had built an empire, commanded fortunes, and shaped industries, yet in that moment he realized he was utterly powerless. He had lost something that no amount of money could buy, something more valuable than all the contracts and titles in the world. As the doors closed behind Emily and the little girl, a hollow ache consumed him, one that whispered a truth he could no longer deny. He would give everything, his company, his wealth, his reputation, just for one chance to be part of their lives. Michael left the hotel that evening with the image of Emily and the little girl burned so deeply into his mind that he could not think of anything else. His car waited outside, sleek and black as always, but when he sank into the leather seat, he barely noticed the driver asking where to go. He gave no answer, because he didn't know anymore. For years, his path had been straight and clear: grow the empire, crush competitors, and climb higher and higher until there was nothing left above him. But now, one fleeting encounter had broken that path in half. He leaned back, his head pressed against the seat, and all he could see was the way the girl had looked at him with curious eyes, the very same eyes that stared back at him in the mirror each morning. His daughter. He had denied her existence for 5 years, but in that moment there was no longer any denying the truth. The following days were a blur, though his outward life continued with its usual pace. He sat through meetings where executives presented figures and strategies, but he heard none of it. He signed contracts without really reading them, his hand moving on autopilot while his mind drifted to thoughts of Emily carrying their child alone, of her rocking their daughter to sleep without him, of her teaching their little girl to walk, to speak, to laugh. He had missed it all, every milestone, every first word, every scraped knee and bedtime story. The realization crushed him with a weight unlike anything he had ever carried. For the first time in his life, victory tasted like ash, and even the applause of shareholders felt like mockery. He found himself staring out windows for long stretches, his reflection looking back at him hollow and tired, wondering how he had let fear rob him of what truly mattered. At night, the silence of his penthouse became unbearable. Once it had been a place of power, a sanctuary where he celebrated victories and planned his next conquest. Now it was a cavern of echoes. He poured himself drink after drink, but no amount of scotch could quiet the memory of his daughter's face. He saw her everywhere, in the blue of the sky, in the sound of children's laughter on the street, in the innocence he had once believed himself too hardened to deserve. He thought of Emily too, of the strength in her gaze, of the way she had stood tall in the hotel lobby, shielding their daughter from him with a single look. He could not blame her, she had every right to hate him, every right to deny him. But he could not walk away this time, not when he had seen what he had lost. On the third night, unable to bear it any longer, he sat down at his desk and wrote a letter. The words did not come easily. He was a man accustomed to speeches that convinced investors to part with millions, to strategies that bent industries to his will. But this was different. Every sentence felt clumsy, inadequate, stripped bare of the power he wielded in every other arena. He told her he was sorry, though he knew apologies meant little after years of absence. He confessed that he had been afraid, that his pride and ambition had blinded him, that he had chosen control over love and lived to regret it. He asked for nothing, no forgiveness, no second chance, only for the opportunity to meet his daughter, to hear her voice, to let her know she had a father even if she could never accept him. When the letter was finished, he stared at it for hours before sealing it and sending it, uncertain if she would ever read it. Emily did read it. She sat at her kitchen table late one evening after putting Lily to bed, her hands trembling as she unfolded the pages. Her eyes scanned the words, her heart tightening with every line. Part of her wanted to tear it up immediately, to throw it into the trash and shut the door on him once and for all. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the man she had once loved, the part that could not deny the truth of his regret, made her pause. She tucked the letter away in a drawer, telling herself it meant nothing, yet she found herself rereading it the next night, and the night after that. Michael, for his part, waited. Each day he checked his phone compulsively, hoping for a reply that never came. He lingered near the school where Lily was enrolled, careful not to intrude, but desperate for even a glimpse of her. He watched her skip out of the building with her backpack, laughing with friends, her hair catching the sunlight just as his once had. It tore at him to remain at a distance, but he knew Emily would never forgive him if he overstepped. Still, he could not stop himself from being there, from hoping she would notice him one day and realize he was not going away. Weeks turned into months, and the emptiness in his life grew unbearable. He no longer cared about quarterly reports or market expansions. Those victories seemed trivial compared to the sound of his daughter's laughter as she ran past him on the sidewalk, oblivious to who he was. One evening, unable to hold back, he stepped closer when Emily came to collect Lily. His voice shook as he said her name, and when she turned, her eyes were colder than the sharpest blade. He told her he was not there to disrupt, not there to take anything away, only to ask for a chance. He begged her to let him know his daughter, even if only from a distance, even if only for a few moments. He admitted that he would give up everything, his company, his wealth, his reputation, just to hear Lily call him Dad once in his life. Emily said nothing at first. She only looked at him, her expression unreadable, her arm wrapped tightly around their daughter. Then she shook her head slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You made your choice, Michael," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "And we learned to live without you." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk, the city lights blurring behind his tears. That night, Michael realized that he was no longer the man who had once sent her away with cold indifference. He was a man broken open, stripped of everything but regret and longing. And for the first time in his life, he understood that there were some battles he could not win with power, some losses he could never buy back. If he wanted a place in his daughter's life, he would have to prove himself not with words or wealth, but with patience, humility, and the one thing he had always feared to give, his heart. Michael's life began to fracture under the weight of his obsession, though outwardly nothing seemed to change. His company continued to thrive, the board continued to applaud his vision, and the press continued to call him unstoppable, but inside he was unraveling. Every day that passed without Emily's forgiveness felt like a punishment he had more than earned, and yet his resolve to be present for his daughter only deepened. He could not forget the way Lily had looked at him in the hotel lobby, her innocent curiosity cutting through him more sharply than any accusation. He thought of her constantly, what she liked to eat, what stories made her laugh, whether she preferred drawing or climbing trees. He knew almost nothing about her, and that ignorance gnawed at him like a wound that refused to heal. He began to appear in the background of her life, always careful not to push too far. From his car parked discreetly down the block, he watched as Emily walked Lily to school, her small hand swinging from her mother's with carefree joy. On weekends, he spotted them at the park, Lily racing down the slides, her golden hair shining in the sunlight. He never approached, never allowed himself to disrupt, but every glimpse only fueled his determination. For a man who had once lived in the spotlight, commanding attention with ease, the humility of simply standing in the shadows became both his penance and his discipline. Emily noticed him, of course. At first, anger surged within her every time she caught sight of him lingering near, his tall frame impossible to mistake, his piercing blue eyes following them from a distance. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he leave them alone, to remind him again and again of the night he had told her he was not ready. But she also saw something different in him, something she could not quite reconcile with the man she remembered. There was no arrogance in his posture now, no entitlement in his gaze. There was only a quiet desperation, the look of a man who had been stripped bare of excuses and was willing to wait as long as it took. One afternoon, when Lily was playing in the park, fate forced an interaction neither of them could have anticipated. Emily had looked away for only a moment, distracted by a phone call, when Lily wandered too close to the edge of the playground and tripped. Her knees hit the ground hard, and she began to cry, her small voice piercing through the laughter around her. Before Emily could reach her, Michael was already there. He crouched down, scooped Lily up gently, and brushed the dirt from her scraped skin with a tenderness that startled even him. He whispered softly, his voice steady and calm, telling her she was safe, that everything would be all right. Lily, still sobbing, clung to his shirt without hesitation, burying her face in his shoulder as if she instinctively trusted him. Emily froze at the sight, her chest tightening with conflicting emotions. Anger at his intrusion warred with the undeniable truth of what she was seeing. Her daughter, who rarely sought comfort from strangers, was nestled against him as though she had known him her whole life. Michael looked up at Emily then, his eyes filled with sorrow and hope, silently begging her not to pull the child away too quickly. For a long moment, the three of them existed in fragile stillness, the world around them fading into background noise. When Emily finally stepped forward, her voice was tight. "Give her to me," she said, though the words trembled more than she wanted them to. Michael obeyed immediately, gently transferring the little girl back into her mother's arms. Lily sniffled but looked at him with wide eyes, her tears already drying, as though she sensed something important had just happened. That night, Emily lay awake long after Lily had fallen asleep, replaying the scene in her mind. She wanted to stay angry, wanted to cling to the bitterness that had carried her through the hardest years, but the memory of Michael holding their daughter so naturally kept breaking through. She had expected him to falter, to stand stiff and uncomfortable as most men of his world would. Instead, he had been gentle, protective, and unshakably calm. It unsettled her to realize that maybe he was not the same man anymore. For Michael, the moment had been life-altering. The warmth of Lily in his arms, the sound of her small voice calming as he whispered reassurances, had filled him with a sense of belonging he had never known. It was as though a missing piece of his soul had been restored, even if only briefly. That night, in his cavernous penthouse, he could still smell the faint trace of her hair against his shirt, still feel the weight of her trust pressing against him. He sat in the dark, his glass of scotch untouched, whispering aloud that he would not give up, not this time, not when he finally understood what he was fighting for. The next day, he did something uncharacteristic of a man who had built a reputation on ruthless efficiency. He cleared his schedule. Meetings were postponed, deals delayed, calls ignored. He began spending his days in smaller, quieter ways, often near the places he knew Emily and Lily would be. When he finally approached Emily directly a week later, he didn't come with demands or promises. He came humbly, asking only for the chance to be present, to prove himself through actions rather than words. His voice shook when he told her he didn't expect forgiveness, that he knew he had forfeited any right to her trust, but that he could not bear to live as a stranger to his daughter anymore. Emily studied him for a long time, her arms folded protectively across her chest. She wanted to tell him no, to end it there, but the memory of her daughter's calm in his arms returned, softening her resolve. Finally, she gave him the smallest chance, a sliver of opportunity that surprised even her. "If you're serious," she said quietly, "you'll show me. Not with words. Not with money. With consistency. With patience." Her voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. Michael nodded, his throat tight, his heart pounding with a fragile hope. For the first time in years, he felt that the wall between them had shifted, not enough to let him through, but enough to let in the faintest flicker of light. Michael took Emily's words as though they were both a sentence and a lifeline. Consistency and patience, two things he had never mastered in his personal life, became his daily practice. He began to show up in ways that shocked even himself. Every morning, before the first board meeting, he stopped by the school just to watch Lily skip through the doors with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. He never intruded, never called out, but the sight gave him strength in a way that market reports and stock tickers never could. In the afternoons, when Emily allowed it, he would take them both to the park, where he sat cross-legged in the grass, his once perfectly tailored suits exchanged for rolled-up sleeves and worn shoes. He discovered that his daughter's favorite game was to challenge him to run endless races across the field, and though his lungs burned and his legs ached, he never once let her down. Emily remained cautious, watching him closely, her arms often folded as though to remind herself of the wall she had built. Yet she could not deny the transformation taking place before her eyes. The man who had once told her he wasn't ready to be a father now sat patiently through Lily's tea parties, sipping imaginary cups and pretending plastic pastries were gourmet meals. He read storybooks with a voice that wavered when the words touched something deep inside him, and he allowed Lily to climb across his lap with complete abandon, his hands steady and protective. More than once, Emily caught herself staring at him when he wasn't looking, stunned by how natural he seemed, how different he was from the polished, arrogant figure she remembered from years ago. One evening, after a long day, Lily fell asleep in the back seat of Emily's car while they were driving home. Michael had been with them at the park, and when Emily pulled up outside her apartment, he insisted on carrying the little girl upstairs. Emily hesitated but finally allowed it. She walked behind him as he carried their daughter, her head resting against his shoulder, her arms looped loosely around his neck. For a moment, Emily felt as though she was watching a life that might have been theirs all along, a picture of the family they could have been if he had chosen differently. The thought both comforted and broke her. Later that night, after Lily had been tucked into bed, Emily found herself alone with Michael in the quiet living room. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words. He broke the silence first, his voice low, stripped of the authority he used with the rest of the world. He admitted he thought of every moment he had missed, from Lily's first cry to her first steps, and how it haunted him to know he could never reclaim those years. His eyes glistened as he confessed that he was terrified she would grow up and see him only as a stranger who had abandoned her. For a man who had built his life on power and control, such vulnerability was shocking, and it left Emily momentarily speechless. She reminded him, with a firmness that wavered under the weight of emotion, that regret did not undo the past. She told him how hard those years had been, how many nights she had cried herself to sleep while rocking their infant alone, how many sacrifices she had made that he had never seen. Her words were sharp, and she expected him to fight back, to defend himself, but he didn't. Instead, he bowed his head, his jaw tight as though each sentence was a lash he knew he deserved. He whispered that he could never erase her pain, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to make sure she never felt it again. That was the moment Emily's certainty began to falter. She had always believed Michael incapable of humility, of placing someone else before his ambition, yet here he was, not demanding forgiveness but quietly begging for the chance to prove himself. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, saw the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own guilt, and for the first time, she wondered if he truly had changed. She still carried the scars of his rejection, and she would not let herself forget them easily, but the wall she had built around her heart began to show its first cracks. In the days that followed, Michael continued to show up, not in grand gestures but in the small, steady ways that mattered most. He brought simple meals when Emily was too tired to cook, he fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen without being asked, and he spent hours helping Lily build towers of blocks only to laugh when she knocked them down. Emily noticed how patient he was, how he never raised his voice, how he listened intently to Lily's endless questions as though every word from her mouth was the most important thing he had ever heard. She had expected him to grow bored or impatient, to eventually retreat back into the comfort of his empire, but he didn't. Day after day, he stayed. For the first time since she had left him, Emily allowed herself to feel something dangerous: hope. It was faint, fragile, and she guarded it carefully, but it was there nonetheless. And though she did not say it aloud, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the man who had once told her he wasn't ready could become the father, and perhaps even the partner, she and Lily deserved. The months that followed were unlike anything Michael had ever known. He had lived through the chaos of corporate wars, through nights when billions rested on the sharpness of his decisions, through the intoxicating high of standing at the top of his empire, but none of it compared to the quiet rhythm of a child's laughter or the warmth of being invited, however tentatively, into the life he had once abandoned. Slowly, Emily allowed him to step closer, testing his persistence, watching for cracks, expecting him to grow tired or revert to the man who had once broken her. But Michael never faltered. He rearranged his life in ways that shocked even his closest advisors. Board meetings were rescheduled so he could attend Lily's school recital. International deals were delayed so he could spend a weekend helping her paint her room a brighter color. The man who had once believed he was not ready to be a father found himself living for the smallest moments of fatherhood, and to his own surprise, those moments filled him with a joy deeper than any victory in business ever had. Emily noticed the transformation, though she fought against acknowledging it for as long as she could. There were nights when she would stand in the kitchen doorway, her arms folded, as she watched Michael sit cross-legged on the floor with Lily, surrounded by dolls, crayons, and stuffed animals. His once impeccable clothes were wrinkled and smudged with marker, his golden hair falling out of place as Lily insisted on styling it with clips and ribbons. He let her, laughing without hesitation, his blue eyes shining with a warmth Emily had never seen in him before. She felt her heart tremble in those moments, because this was not the cold man who had once told her to forget him. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been stripped of arrogance and left with nothing but love. The true breaking point came one night when a storm rattled the small town with heavy rain and thunder. Lily woke in the middle of the night crying, frightened by the booming sounds outside. Emily rushed to her room, prepared to comfort her, but she found Michael already there. He had been staying in the guest room, something Emily had reluctantly agreed to after weeks of persistence. He sat beside Lily's bed, stroking her golden hair gently, whispering reassurances that calmed her almost instantly. She clung to his shirt, her sobs quieting as she buried her face against him, and Emily stood frozen in the doorway, the scene pulling at every part of her soul. The man who had once rejected them was now the one their daughter turned to instinctively, and he held her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. Emily's throat tightened, and for the first time, she realized that her anger and fear no longer outweighed her hope. When the storm passed and Lily finally drifted back to sleep, Emily and Michael found themselves sitting in the living room, the dim light casting shadows across their faces. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people on the edge of something unspoken. Michael's voice broke first, rough with emotion. He told her that he had spent years convincing himself that wealth and power were enough, that he had been a fool to believe love was a weakness. He admitted that the night he had told her he wasn't ready had been the worst mistake of his life, one that haunted him every day since. He said that he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he would spend the rest of his life proving to her and to Lily that he was no longer the man she had once known. Emily listened, her arms wrapped around herself, her heart torn between the memory of betrayal and the undeniable truth of the man sitting before her now. When he finished, she looked at him for a long time, her blue eyes searching his, and she whispered words that surprised them both. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said softly. "But I can't deny what I see anymore. You're here, and you're different. And she needs you. Maybe. I do too." Michael's breath caught, his heart pounding with a fragile hope he had not dared to believe in. He reached out, hesitating, giving her every chance to pull away, but when her hand finally met his, the weight of years lifted in an instant. It was not full forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, fragile and real. In the weeks that followed, their lives slowly began to merge. Emily allowed Michael into more of their daily routines, letting him pick Lily up from school, letting him help with meals, letting him be there for both the mundane and the extraordinary moments. Lily, bright and perceptive, accepted him without hesitation, her innocence untarnished by the pain that had passed between her parents. To her, he was simply Daddy now, and the way she said it the first time brought Michael to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he held her tightly. For Emily, the journey was slower, more cautious. She carried her scars too deeply to let them go overnight. Yet every day that Michael showed up, every smile he gave their daughter, every act of quiet devotion chipped away at the walls she had built. She found herself laughing again in his presence, found herself remembering the man she had once loved, and realized that perhaps he had been buried all along, waiting for the moment he would be forced to rise. The story of Michael Anderson, the millionaire CEO who once declared he wasn't ready to be a father, became something of a whispered legend even among those who had only known him as a ruthless businessman. To the world, he had shocked them all by turning away from certain deals, by skipping important meetings, by choosing time with his daughter over endless ambition. But to Emily and Lily, he was simply theirs, a man who had fallen, who had broken, who had lost everything that mattered, and who had finally found his redemption not in power, but in love. And though the scars of the past would never fully vanish, they were no longer chains. They were reminders of how far they had come, and how precious their fragile, beautiful second chance truly was.